and settle in with us for the hour as today's speakers unpack how Just Capital tracks, analyzes, and ranks the largest US companies on their stakeholder performance, how these companies supported their workers, customers, and communities through the pandemic, as well as the actions these companies are taking to advance racial equity. Speaking of our presenters, let me introduce them. I'm very pleased to welcome the CEO of Just Capital, Martin Whittaker. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Gabriel, and thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
So great to have you. Thanks so much. And leading our discussion today, our co-founder and CEO, Dr. David Rock. Hello, David.
Hey, Gabe, good to be here with you. Thanks for setting this up. See, we've got a good group here. And Martin, great to be here with you. Thanks for making time. This is a really important conversation. It always has been an important conversation, but it seems like companies really care now about this more than they ever have. I'm delighted to get this time. We've been watching you guys, watching Just Capital for the last few years, and really loving the research you're doing and quoting you in a few places. And I actually at one point was thinking about building a ranking for how human organizations are being, sort of how much they're kind of working within the way humans really work. And then I saw you guys had already done it, so here we are. I'm very happy that
together we could probably do a better job together. But no, I really appreciate the chance to just come and talk about what we're doing. I think it's a crucial conversation, quite honestly, for the country. I think it's happening all over the country right now. I see so many folks in the chat from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, Portugal in the house. I mean, it's great to see. So I think the topics we're about to discuss are universal and really important at this moment in time.
Yeah, it really comes through. Speaking of countries, those of you trying to work it out, I'm Australian, he's English, and we both live in the US. So that's what's going on here. Some external commentators on the world of what's happening here. For those of you new to NLI, we are a research-driven leadership institute. We've been going since 1998. We have operations in 24 countries. And when we're not researching, we're advising organizations. And now it's over 50 of the Fortune 100. And about 13.5 million people learned our work directly in the last few years. We're really excited to be able to contribute to the whole question of how do we create more diverse and equitable and inclusive organizations in a really big way through the science, but also just how to develop leaders better, how to really rethink, how to rethink how we work with humans. And our vision is making organizations more human through science. It's literally what we're about. So let's dig in. Martin, the big question, it's sort of a big question. It's like we need a bottle of wine in a week or a case of wine in a week to debate this one. Do we need a better capitalism? Tell us, I mean, probably the gut instinct is yes, but what does the data say?
Well, I don't think we need a week or wine to know the answer is yes, emphatic yes. I think there are lots of reasons for that, and I'll show you some of the polling that we do, but just for the benefit of those who don't know just that well, I will say very quickly, our mission, we are a nonprofit 501c3, despite the name Just Capital. We're not a money manager, we're a nonprofit. And our mission is to build a more just and inclusive economy that works for all Americans. And we do that by changing the behavior of big companies. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a few minutes. But the belief is if you can get big corporations to do things in a more just, humane way, as you're saying, good things happen. You can really address systemic, societal, and environmental and economic challenges. And if you don't get the private sector pulling in that direction, you're fighting an uphill battle. So we were founded 7 years ago by philanthropists, market people, capitalists, believers in capitalism, who felt that actually we've got to do more. The private sector, markets, and big business in particular has just got to do more. And you know what? It's in companies' enlightened self-interest, as I say a lot, to actually do more because it's better business. And I'll show you some data that supports that. But what you see here is one of the things we do at Just is throughout the year and every year, we go out and we talk to ordinary Americans all around the country to ask them what they think a just company looks like. And so it doesn't matter what Martin Whittaker thinks or our board members or our team. This is all about really meeting people where they are. And we ask all sorts of questions about capitalism and the economy. And then we bring it to a head when we're talking to people about what makes a just company today. And I'll describe that later. But just to kick off on this bigger theme, you can see we are really probing on how people feel about the economy right now. The truth is, the vast majority of Americans think the economy is not currently serving all Americans. And you know what? They're absolutely right. They also want large companies to do more to promote an economy that serves all Americans. And yet only 50% of Americans think that that's actually going on. The companies are doing a good job of that. Before we leave this, I would say we must get this economy working for more people. If you don't feel like you have a stake in something, bad things happen. And I think this is all about trust and faith in the system and trying to do what so many of us have in common, which is build a better future for ourselves and our families and our communities and our loved ones. So that's really at the root of what Just Capital does.
No, that's great. Thanks, Martin. And it reminds me a bit of some work I saw a few years ago. There's a couple of researchers, also from the UK, wrote a book called The Spirit Level. I don't know if you've seen that work, but they essentially tackled the question, what happens when societies are more unfair, more unequitable? And they actually created an equity kind of scale for states within the US and for countries everywhere. And they basically correlated the equity quotient against health outcomes from birth to death, and for everyone, not just for different levels. It's called The Spirit Level. My team can find it, put it in the chat. And they've got a new book as well. And what they found is that actually everyone is less healthy when there's more inequality. Everyone is actually suffering. But they also found, very strong correlation between health outcomes all the way from birth to death for people. So it's, it has really big implications that people are, feel like there's some degree of equity in there for sure.
So that's 100% right. So right at the beginning of Just Capital, and it's still on our website, our founder and chair, Paul Tudor Jones, gave a TED talk, and he talked about exactly what you've just said, David. The USA in particular is off the charts when it comes to inequality, and that's in nobody's long-term best interest. In fact, it doesn't end well, and that was kind of prescient when we think about what's happened recently and the grave divisions we have in the country right now. And at the root of that, I think is, we need a system that works for more people, as you just said. In fact, if you go to the next slide, we sort of, this is again, all of this is on our website at justcapital.com. We publish all of our polling and our survey work, but you can see here how many people think, the current form of capitalism is working, and whether or not we need a more evolved form of capitalism to build a better future, create the society that I want for the next generation. And we found the majority of people actually believe that this more evolved form of capitalism, its time has come. And so I think what we're seeing in the country right now is sort of that transition process happening. And it's like any major transition, it's messy, it's got its proponents and its opponents. So it's sort of like we feel like we're in the middle of that right now societally, and I think that's going to continue for a while longer. But we really believe fervently that especially in our world, corporate America has a lot that it can do, and a lot that it is doing, quite honestly, in order to bring that transition about. Right,
and not to get too off the rails here. I might go off the rails. Australians are known to do that here and there, but. I sometimes think about, capitalism in North America in particular, or in the US, is driven a lot by the sort of non-conscious priming that the Constitution provides us. So the culture is kind of, in many ways, driven by sort of the capitalism frameworks are driven a lot by the culture, which is driven a lot by kind of how we believe we should be as Americans, and some of that the Constitution. And then I think about, when was the Constitution written again? How many hundreds of years ago? Before medicine kind of really existed, before we knew anything about the brain, before we knew almost anything about psychology. A bunch of guys got in a room, made some stuff up. We sort of hold it like, we bow down to it. But we know unbelievably more now about how humans function and how societies function than we did 300 years ago. But that's kind of sacrosanct, and that's kind of driving a lot of what we do. So it's almost like we need, new capitalism and a kind of almost a new set of values to underpin that capitalism as well. But as I said, we could go off the rails pretty fast there.
Yeah, I just quickly on that, I've written and blogged a lot about the American dream. We're both immigrants, and I can just speak personally. I chose to come here and raise my kids here, and raise a family and put down roots here because I believe in that. I felt like this was an amazing country which could do incredible things and provide great opportunity. And I think that is something that you want everybody here to believe and to have a stake in and to realize. Many people are excluded from that economy. We've had a reckoning with racial equity last year, which is bringing racial divisions to the surface. And
which is not over. That feels like a warm up. Yeah,
that's playing out. And I think this ideal, this sort of centralizing idea that I can build a better future here, and it's down to me and my endeavor and my hard work and all of that. I think this is about growing the pie for everybody and giving everybody access, to that. Create sort of much greater equity when it comes to that access to that dream. And so that's what we're trying to create. And if you do that, you can create an economic engine that grows the pie for everybody. So this is not about wealth redistribution, I don't think anyway. I think this is about growing the pie for more people and for more people believing in that system.
Yeah. No, obviously you get a strong reaction, and that you get some political responses. Sometimes you get a strong reaction when you're talking about, more for everyone. People feel like they might lose something, and particularly people in power react very strongly when they feel like they're under threat. There's a whole lot of research on that, and often react irrationally because it sort of feels really dangerous to come from sort of a high pedestal down, and feels like you have a lot to lose. So some interesting reactions we could dig into. But let's talk about a little bit more about your work, and from your perspective, what makes a company actually more just? Like, how do you define it? And I know we've got some examples here, but yeah, how do you define a just company, and what do they do differently?
So, to be crystal clear, the American people define what a just company is through our survey and polling work and our quantitative weighting. So essentially what it boils down to, David, it's pretty simple in the end. You get 5 stakeholders: how a company treats its workers, its customers, the communities where it operates, including supply chains globally, the environment, and then its investors. Is it well governed? Is it led by people with integrity? Those are the 5 major buckets. Underneath each one of those are a set of specific issues that we measure companies on. And all of those issues come also from our polling. So under workers, for example, one of the most, if not the most for many years now, has been, does a company pay a fair and livable wage? So great, we hear that wherever we go. That's whoever we talk to, you tend to see that is one of the most heavily weighted in terms of its importance. So we then go and analyze the universe of companies that we're currently focused on, which is the 1,000 largest publicly traded companies in America. We analyze them as objectively and in as data-driven a way as we can on each of those issues. And we then, from that analysis, we produce various outputs, rankings. We produce the Just 100. We rank companies by sector. On our website, you can track companies against a customized subset. We track them by theme, so you can see who's the best at paying a living wage. And so the definition of just overall is sort of the totality of all of those things, right?
Nice.
So that's sort of like what we do as an organization. And of course, we take that data and we support investment products with it. We have 7 or 8 investment funds now, and we're pushing well over $250 million in assets under influence in those funds. We work directly with the companies themselves because many companies that we track are seeking to be better on some or all of those things, or just overall on stakeholder capitalism. So, but you bring it back down to like, where does the rubber hit the road? what we've found is that compared to their peers, the most just companies, whether by sector or overall, they are they do better on diversity, equity, and inclusion. They pay their people better. They are more generous philanthropically. They are better environmentally. They have much greater engagement with their employees and with their customers. So they do well on all of those things, and they also do better financially.
We'll get to that in a minute. We'll get to that in a minute. I have a question, Martin. How do you think it happens? Is it like one CEO has a dream and make it happen, or is it an accident of nature? Is it a geography? How do you think these companies can sort of end up in this place? I'm guessing you've thought about that a lot.
I have, and we talk to companies all the time about that very question. I used to think it was kind of a complex messiness and where different sets of circumstances drove behavior. There's an element of that. You get companies go through major events, negative events, something bad happens and there's a turnaround. But typically, honestly, David, it comes down to leadership. Mm-hmm. Either the CEO or the C-suite. There's leadership within a company that says, this is what we stand for. This is how we're going to do business. This is our recipe for success. This is our North Star.
Right.
And you build from there. Now, none of this is easy, but that's what you build. It's not the case, because people talk about causation and correlation all the time. I have yet to meet a CEO who treated all their stakeholders really badly, was financially successful, and then all of a sudden said, now we're successful, we're going to be nice guys. We're going to start to do well by our stakeholders. Never seen that happen. It's typically, okay, this is what we stand for. This is how we're going to do it. And that then sort of drives success in lots of different ways over time.
I'm thinking about the values of an organization. So we do a lot of work to help companies rationalize or relaunch kind of all the artifacts by which they describe their culture. So we do a lot of work in that space. We helped Microsoft rethink their whole definition of leadership and then scale that. We've helped about 25 companies so far, big companies like Microsoft, rethink how they define their culture in language. So values, vision, mission, leadership model, framework, all this stuff. And, when we look at values, for example, if you looked at like 100 company sets of values from a distance, you would just look at those values and say, oh, this is a just company. They're doing all these things. So it's clearly not in the values statements that this stuff is. And I think it's got to be in the CEO and the C-suite's vision. It's got to be, something that they're willing to fight for, not just believe in. And I think because it does take some fighting against pressures to do this stuff.
Look, it's being a just company is a journey, not a destination. You're never done. Competitive dynamics today for any company are incredibly complex, and the whole relationship between business and society is shifting. And those who are better at creating value for all their stakeholders will do better competitively and in the market. Period. End of story. I believe that. If you go one slide forward,
let's have a look.
Microsoft, as luck would have it, they're actually right at the top of our list. One of the things we do is produce a sort of a head-to-head comparison of all companies in any sector. And Microsoft is the number one. And Satya Nadella spoke at our flagship event last year on what happened. Why do they, to your question, why do they do what they do? How do they do it? How are they changing? This is not meant to imply that Microsoft can't get any better. On the contrary, they know that they're, where they need to focus, but on a relative basis, they are really, really good. And what we measure is sort of, I guess, the much more practical elements of how that vision is manifested. Show us the data on your performance on fair pay. Show us what's actually happening around your policies and your disclosure and your work internally on diversity. Show us what you're doing, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of takes the high level stuff and boils it down to very specific measurable things, which, as I said, when you go out into the world and talk to people on Main Street, that's what they think about. That's what I want to know.
Yeah, certainly the CEO's vision is gonna play a lot, but it doesn't always also have to be the CEO. It could be the C-suite and a bunch of really passionate people, and then the CEO gets on board. But I think it's going to be easier if the CEO certainly has that vision. A couple of things coming up for me I want to comment on. I'll take the slides down for a moment just to have a conversation. A couple of things coming up. I'm thinking about the mindset actually of leaders in organizations that sort of are interested in this. And there's a number of different sort of distinctions that are out there around mindset. And I think there's another, there's theory X and theory Y. Theory X is people need to be controlled, and theory Y is people need to be unleashed. And leaders have this mindset of either, we have to like micromanage people now because they're working at home. We have to like put technology in to watch every keystroke and see when they have keystroke gaps and call them. Like some companies are doing that, which is, I think, crazy, because people on the whole are more productive, a day a week if they are left alone. So there's sort of theory X, theory Y. There's also growth and fixed mindset. If you have a fixed mindset, you believe that, talent is to be assessed and put into buckets. And a growth mindset, you think talent is to be grown and nurtured and evolved. There's also just going on a comment someone made, there's a belief that there are finite resources and we have to compete. But if you kind of pull back a bit, the resources that we all have to deal with are probably infinite. We just haven't got necessarily the technology there. I mean, the energy hitting the earth is infinite, just about, certainly for the next billion years, may as well be. So there are sort of different schools of thought, an abundance mentality versus a, highly, highly competitive. And this is the last thing I'll say. We the last couple of events, annual events or flagship events we've run, we've talked a lot about the different mindset that leaders have. And essentially there's exploitative, depletive, sustainable, or regenerative. And most leaders have never ever thought about this. And exploitative is mostly illegal now. Exploitative is, you take everything out of the system, like a farm, you just exploit the land, but it's poisoned the next year. Depletive is where most farms and energy production and even human capital practices are, which is you're not killing people or things, but you're still leaving things depleted. Sustainable is sort of neutral, but the best idea is regenerative. And regenerative practices are, if you have a farm, every year the land is actually more rich, the wildlife is more healthy and more abundant, the nutrients even richer. And you can apply that to talent practices and people practices. Every year actually your people get healthier, wealthier, smarter, more connected, more successful as your organization does. And so that's an idea we've been playing with and starting to really dig into. And I think there's some important parallels with just kind of and some organizations have been able to sort of get their head around that a little bit. Any comments on depletive through regenerative there?
No, I love the framing. I am an environmental scientist in my early career, so it resonates with me. I think if I were to tell you that there are millions of full-time employees at large publicly traded companies who still rely on food stamps and government support to make ends meet. Is that depletive? Is that exploitative, actually? Like now you have sort of like a system which has created a low-wage culture that essentially drives down wages to the point where full-time workers need a couple of jobs to get by, and in fact, can't get by without government support. So the taxpayers subsidizing shareholders at those companies to drive that quarterly earnings cycle. Now, so there's got to be a regenerative agricultural analogy there, because that's a race to the bottom. That for society doesn't, like we said before, it doesn't end well. You have to shift thinking around to address that. And there are probably many, many other examples. And it reinforces division, because most of those people who are at that, are at that sort of end of the wage spectrum are, frontline workers, Black and brown workers, people who don't have access to the same kind of, in many cases, banking, financial resources. So it becomes a very, very downward spiral.
Yeah,
I think you talk about breaking the cycle through a more regenerative thinking, apply that to the economic system, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think I'm dreaming maybe of a time where we do a a survey of what percentage of American companies are exploitative, depletive, sustainable, and regenerative, I think we'll find regenerative at well less than 1%, and even sustainable at, if you're looking at their talent practices more deeply even than you do, because we would like to look at, as we think about what makes an organization more human, they're working with how the brain works. They're not, like, in terms of, how they onboard people, how they do performance management, how they, teach them stuff, how they learn, how they develop people, that they're actually following the biological principles of how people work. And the obvious way to think about that is they're not, if you think about food, they're not, giving people a canteen to eat on Monday and then expecting they eat on Monday for the week. They're not following biological principles means, letting people eat 3 meals a day. And when it comes to performance management and learning and these other things, there are actually clear biological principles that organizations, if they respect humans, would follow. And so there's a sort of deeper dive that we may have to talk to you about and see if we can put together an even more just 100 together or something. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? That's the point. It's good for business. It's better business to do that. We've been working closely with PayPal recently because the work they've done to address sort of their employees' financial hardship. And Dan Schulman, the CEO, talks about this survey that they did, which he thought would be a great news, event, an employee engagement survey. Turns out they had a whole bunch of employees that, were experiencing real distress, and they created a whole program around it of lifting wages and lowering benefit costs and providing ownership of the company and financial education. And guess what? It was a great business return on that. So we've seen that financial outperformance. We have some charts, I know, in there somewhere where we unpack that a lot. So I totally agree with you. And I think it's actually a major sort of undiscovered frontier, if you will, of corporate competitiveness.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Let's just go back to the data for a minute. I mean, this for me is just so poignant. It tells the story really clearly. And then there's a bunch of questions about diversity, equity, inclusion. Let's dig into that next. But I mean, I think this graph kind of tells the story, right?
Yeah, you've got this is the market performance of our top 20% of companies on workers, how they performed on a whole set of worker categories versus the laggards. And it's really interesting. This is over the last 12 months or so. So starts in September, October 2019, goes through the pandemic. What's interesting is you get to January 2020, bang, look at that. Guess what? Companies that really invested in their workers and did well on those criteria outperformed those that did not by an absolute mile.
Right.
And that's through the teeth of a global pandemic. So there's something there, David, that is a really interesting signal. And I think that companies that are on that red line, that top line there, have a lot to teach, other companies about, okay, what's working? Why are we more resilient? How is this translating into market performance and financial performance?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I want to spend some time unpacking this with you. The inflection points are so interesting, and obviously as the pandemic really hit in March, April, the stronger companies did better, and the other companies did a lot worse. And then they come together. It'd be really interesting to unpack this. So a bunch of questions. Let's dig into diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you've got some charts. Maybe let's move through those relatively quickly, get to some questions. But I think some of your charts, tell the story. Tell us a little bit about this to start with.
Yeah, so real quick, this is, hugely important issue, obviously, nationally. After George Floyd, we began polling Americans on what companies should do. And we also got a lot of calls from companies saying, what should we do? We saw companies make, a lot of sort of public statements in support of Black Lives Matter and action on racial equity. And so we began to really track this more closely, and that's ongoing work for us. What you see here is the percent of respondents in a survey we did who say workplace policy to promote racial diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. And, maybe not as a surprise, but the vast majority of people felt it was either very important or somewhat important to do these major actions: commit to paying all employees a living wage, provide accessible grievance mechanisms, fund local education and create apprenticeships and scholarships, and analyze wages by ethnicity and gender, and address pay gaps. And so you begin to see how companies now can like tangibly move on from just a great statement and a major donation to the NAACP. If you go to the next slide, we drill down here on disclosure. So, what percentage of companies that made a statement on Black Lives Matter were actually disclosing what they're doing in terms of their workforce composition on racial and ethnic breakdown? You find that 47% of companies that made those statements provided no disclosure. And another quarter, 24%, disclosed sort of general minority. And I think this is a big area. Disclosure on workforce demographics is a step on the journey to understanding where you are as a company and what you can do better. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see even more, just sort of breaking that down. We've been working with big investors, the New York City Comptroller's Office, the Illinois State Treasurer, CalSTRS, around really a corporate engagement exercise where we ask companies to provide disclosure. And as of a few weeks ago, 59 companies, we broke them down by sector on the left side there, have made the information that they publicly disclosed to the Equal Employment Opportunities. There's a certain type of report that companies provide, which provides a more detailed disclosure breakdown. And so you see, there even, we see, again, preponderance, no disclosure. In fact, if anybody listening or watching this wants to go to the best practice, we always lift up Intel as being a really strong performer on that. And if you just go to the last slide.
And just to throw this in there, we actually worked with them on that. We did 3 or 4 years of work with Intel on their whole DE&I strategy. And we were there when they made the commitment to getting rid of the gender pay gap, and they did it within 1 year. We were working with their CEO. We worked right across the whole organization. In fact, probably one of the most fun projects we did, we took about 20 different diverse DEI initiatives from across the company and turned them into, that were sort of very sporadic and not scalable and not speaking to each other, and created 3 really profound, powerful habit activation strategies that impacted all 110,000 people. And over about 2 years, worked with them to really not just rationalize, but really transform their DEI strategy around a few key habits, starting with growth mindset, and then very much focused on inclusion. So just, we're proud of the work we did there as a major global initiative, and happy to hear that they're continuing to do great things.
Yeah, and we love that, because we're just sort of MO is always to try and lift up leadership, showcase what companies are doing so that others can emulate it. And when we interview CEOs of companies all the time on that, and we have a great relationship with Intel, and really trying to find places to showcase their leadership on that issue and other issues too. So it's really important. And I think sharing the best practice, honestly, Dave, is probably one of the biggest sort of things companies can do to really shift that sort of, create that systemic momentum.
Yeah, I think about a moment with the CEO of Intel some years back, BK at the time was the CEO then, and it's similar to a moment I've had with a number of CEOs where we've been sort of brought in by maybe the HR team to kind of brief the folks on DEI. And one of the first things that we want to do is get the leadership to see that bias is insidious, and if you don't actively do something about it, it takes over. And for no fault of anyone's own, nothing to do with racism, it's just how the brain works. There are certainly racist people, but the bigger issue we think is that everyone has a ton of bias. And it's not that you need to generally raise awareness of it, because that does almost nothing. You've got to actually put in place systems and processes to take it out of the system, to take it out of everyday practices. But one of the moments with CEOs I always find really powerful is I'll kind of walk them through the actual science of how bias works in the brain, and show them that even though they, see something really clearly one way, Other people see it completely differently. And there's a number of exercises we do with them, just, showing them different tasks. And I always remember, BK to this day, just sitting there quietly staring at it going, wow, I had no idea that I could actually be completely wrong sometimes and feel completely right. And it's that sort of humility that's really important to get into particularly the C-suite and CEO. Like, the way bias works is you don't know you're having it. You feel absolutely certain, you feel absolutely right, and you can be absolutely wrong. And when we sort of get them to that place, it's sort of like is this mind-opening moment where they start to kind of think more broadly. So lots of fun.
I can definitely relate to that myself. I think, so many leaders in organizations, now I don't just mean CEOs, but there are leaders throughout organizations are, that is, it's really changing how you think, how your own awareness, self-awareness, the level of empathy you have to have as a leader these days. I mean, it's really shifting. And I think you're sort of beginning to see that sort of move through organizations. And ultimately, as I said, it drives performance. We talk about that a lot. In fact, thank you. You've moved the slide up. Sort of you can see here, we talk about disclosure being, it's not the end, it's not the destination, right? The destination is like, are you better at, whatever the issue is? But disclosure and transparency is a really important step on that journey. And it's partly important because the market needs that information. Like, markets can't function if they don't have good information. And if you look at the trajectory of financial disclosure from the 1920s over the last 100 years, and now you think about, we've really only been focused on sort of ESG disclosure, and more recently disclosure on important human issues for several years. We're very, very early in that game. And yet already you begin to see such a wide discrepancy in performance between companies that are really ahead of the game and those that are behind. And I firmly believe the arc of history on disclosure and transparency is only going one way. 5, 10 years from now, we're going to know exactly what companies are doing on all of these issues, not what they say they're doing or what policies are, but what's actually happening and is it working? We're going to know that, and then there'll be some other set of issues that we're just learning at that time. But I think I see this as a transition.
A big issue. Yeah, I'm thinking I might want to do a session with you down the track with our CEOs in our network, just on the impact of disclosure and sort of thinking about what's coming and how that's going to impact. There's been a great idea in the chat that I want to just throw out there, Martin, just not to put you on the spot whatsoever, but someone suggests you and I should go to Capitol Hill and share all this. So are you in?
Love to. I'm up for it. I'm in.
All right, you heard him. So let's do that. I think
let's all go. There's 128 participants. Whoever wants to come.
There you go. I'll take a bus. So I think there's some important things to share there about societal data. So I don't think it's 4 years too late. I think 4 years ago there was the bus would have been turned away, but now we might.
I could tell you. I mean, the Biden administration, they're all in on this stuff. I think that's not to say they're going to get it all right, but I do think there's an openness. I know you're being facetious.
I'm looking at my calendar.
Danny in the chat, but there is a willingness now to begin to think a little differently about the system, and I think it's created an opportunity. And
there's a big opportunity, right?
Yeah, it's really important that we don't sort of go back to the old relationship between government and business around just about taxes and policies and regulation. Like, we try and think, okay, how is the private sector and government going to work together to actually solve problems? And when you look at it that way, you might do things a little differently.
Yeah, no, I did a briefing in the White House about 5 years ago to lots of different agencies in the White House and the OPM and a bunch of folks. It was a fantastic day, actually. So it must be time to go back. We'll get to work on that. Let's change gears a little bit. Some great questions coming in. We'll still have plenty of time for questions, but let's talk about COVID for a moment. I put for a moment because everyone's kind of done talking about COVID a little bit. Although, just going to put it back there, the Stockdale paradox is still really necessary right now, which is, accept this is going to be tough for quite a while, probably. Don't get all hopeful it's going to be, end now. You should still be accepting this is going to be pretty tough for probably a while, and, get on with making it better. Be careful of assuming it's going to just, all be fine, back to normal in a minute. I'm not so sure, but let's talk about COVID. How did companies measure up? What's your data on that realm?
Well, we all want COVID to be over, and so maybe that, I don't know the Stockdale paradox, but
actually, introverts don't. By the way, the introverts are like, please wait, let's go another 5 years. So I wouldn't say we all want it to be over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, business definitely wants it. I certainly do, but we want it to be over, but it's not over. It's not over. And so what businesses are doing right now, and what they have been doing, is super important because it affects the lives of tens of millions of people and communities all around the country and around the world. So what we did was began to track companies right from day one. March 12th, when we moved out of our office in Manhattan, and we began to track what companies are doing and poll the public on what people think companies should be doing. And what we've seen here on this chart, we got a ton of data on this, but here's just one chart. And by the way, if you want to go to our website, you'll see a tracker. So we're tracking, logging what companies are doing on COVID, which is super interesting. But this is sort of in blue, you'll see what Americans wanted companies to do. And in orange, you see how companies actually measured up.
Not great, is it?
Companies did pretty well on work from home, modified schedules. That's the second 2 bars down there. They did not do well on providing worker health and safety equipment, PPE, and they did not do well on dependent care. They started out, what's interesting is companies did actually begin in the first few months of the pandemic. Many of them did the right thing, extended dependent care coverage, provided worker with health and safety equipment, hazard pay, all of that. But what we saw, David, was it just dropped off over time. And we were asking ourselves back in late summer last year, I wonder how much of these actions are going to stick around. And, some companies did that, but many did not. But you see this difference here between, again, expectation and performance.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig more into that data with you, sort of what companies did well. I mean, our experience is probably skewed more towards companies who are doing well, because a lot of our key clients are, by nature, just working really hard on their people and their people practices. And we've been really moved by some of the things companies have done. But on the whole, on average, I guess it's not great. And it's a shame. I think there was some data somewhere I saw from you, like 89% of people wanted wanted companies to use the crisis to really transform their practices. People really wanted COVID to be a spur for organizations to radically change their practices. And, it's sort of like they moved a little, but there's a lot more to do.
Well, the companies in those orange bars are the companies at the top of that chart doing really well financially. Right. So I think we're going to look back on this moment and say, okay, how does a company best get through a major crisis like this, right? You're not going to have a bigger crisis. You're locking down the economy for months on end and then trying to reopen. And when survival is at stake, people have to think differently. And I think one of the legacies of a good legacy of this pandemic will be a willingness to think differently about how business is done.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's definitely some silver linings for the folks who come out the other side of this, but the companies who do as well. It's been a time of tremendous stress on many companies, but other organizations, it's been a time of tremendous growth. I mean, you'd like to be an investor in Zoom in January, and other organizations. We've never been busier at NLI. So I think as you come out the other side, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what really sticks. In 5 years, what kind of practices really stick. But I also agree this is not necessarily the biggest crisis that we'll all hit in our work lifetimes. There could actually be bigger ones. There could be a pandemic that's far more lethal, that impacts children, touch wood, but there could be other issues that come up, environmental issues that suddenly hit us. And, there's all sorts of stuff that could happen. So I think it's an interesting wake-up call for American companies and global companies to be more prepared for the black swan event, for that crazy thing that just, changes everything.
Well, crises move at different speeds and different different sort of levels. You look at climate crisis, you know, you look at the crisis that many Americans who live in poverty face every day. That's a crisis. It's just, we know it's happening all the time. So I think we are more aware of that. I hope we are more aware of that. Certainly Just Capital, if we have a say in it, people will be more aware of that, and how business can address that.
It's interesting. The slower moving crises sometimes need more attention and focus, because we don't focus on them just because they're slower moving. We don't notice them. They're more invisible. Yeah, that's an interesting one. We should write something about that one day. Why slow moving crises need more attention. Just in closing, just a couple of minutes. We got 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll let folks kind of answer a quick poll and close up. But what's your hope for the future? You see a lot of scary data, maybe some inspiring data. What's your hope for the future?
Well, I am an optimist, and I do believe in trying to fix things. And I think that transitioning to this more inclusive, just, stakeholder-based form of capitalism, if you want to call it that, I just think that's an absolute necessity. What makes me hopeful is I see business leaders ready for that. Not all business leaders, but there are many leaders who are ready for that. I see many investors. If you look at the flow of capital into sustainable ESG funds, that money is going, at some point, that money is going to want to know it's making a difference. It's going to ask awkward questions. Okay, are we moving the needle here or not? This is not just an ESG label. I want to know what's going on. So you've got Wall Street shifting, corporate shifting, consumers as well, the public expecting business to be better and do better. And now the fourth element is you have an administration that's opened up a new policy frontier where there seems to be a willingness to see this as something legitimate and not socialism or some form of politics, which I don't believe it is. So it feels to me like you've got these tectonic plates are now kind of coming together, and you could get something done. And I think we have a moment now. You might sense the urgency in my voice, because I do feel as though the next few weeks, months, years are absolutely pivotal. We can't go back to an economy where only fewer and fewer people are benefiting. It's just gonna deepen the divisions, radicalize the agenda. We need just to bring it back, calm it down and bring it back. Let's focus on building this, economic future, because that's what we all have in common. No matter where I've been in the world, what people, who people are, what their backgrounds are, they kind of want the same thing.
Yeah.
Not that different. Most people just want the same thing.
Yeah, I have teenage kids. The older one, her friends and stuff, they sit around and talk about when they're going to start tearing down the walls because, and not in a good way. They're angry. Older teenagers, young 20s, all this. They're angry, and they're going to rise up and do all sorts of things. So and it won't just look like starting their own businesses instead of going to companies, and it won't all just look like nice disruptions. It'll there's some really angry people, particularly the last few years, and I think organizations have a role to play in being fair and being just in every way they can. I know, just speaking of politics before you close off, do you want to speak to this one?
Yeah. So, but I just want to go back to what you just said. We're all passionate about this, and we might not all agree. Well, that's another point, by the way. We have to find a way to disagree. It's fine to disagree. We just have to disagree properly, right? Like, that's actually a healthy start. Let's just figure out how to disagree well, and then we can maybe find areas we can agree on. But anyway, here we look at politics. Obviously, that's the on everybody's minds these days. We hold on Americans' belief on the role of business in protecting democracy. Because let's face it, if you don't have a healthy democracy,
role of business, right?
You don't have any of the above, right? And we found differences between Republican and Democrat sentiment, but we also found areas of agreement. And where you see at the top there, companies should do whatever's necessary to stop the spread of disinformation by identifying and debunking falsehoods and propaganda. Actual surprising agreement, 68% of Republicans, 86% of Democrats.
Right.
We did see some disagreements, you know, whether social media platforms were right to bar accounts from people propagating conspiracies. We've seen disagreements around holding companies accountable. But again, you know, I draw your attention to the last one. I trust CEOs more than politicians when it comes to taking action to protect and uphold democracy. 52% of Republicans, 63% of Democrats. That's pretty close. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful. There are areas where we can agree to disagree, but there are areas where we can actually are in probably more alignment than we are to believe.
Right. We're going to avoid those areas that are deeply political because they bring up kind of, you know, strong emotional responses on things. But overall, if you avoid those kind of pitfalls, there's strong agreement that things could be better. I think that's really interesting. You give me some things to think about for when we get down to DC, virtually or in person. You heard it here first. Look, Martin, it's been so great to get some time with you and think about this. I've made a ton of notes myself about stuff to dig in on, and I think you've given people a lot of great insights as well. So I really appreciate. We're going to leave this open. If you have any other questions or comments, our team will be here till about a minute or two after the hour. We're just going to throw a poll up before people jump off, so we know kind of how to support you following on. Martin, I'll let you jump off. I've got just a closing announcement about our flagship event, but I really appreciate your collaboration here. You know, we share, speaking of common goals, we share a lot of common objectives. You know, you're looking at it from a data point, we're looking at it from a biological perspective, and how do we activate the right habits to actually do this? So hopefully we'll get to collaborate in some creative ways down the track. But thanks for all the work that you and everyone at Just is doing. Really important work, provocative, very data-driven, which we love, and telling some really, really important stories. So thanks for all that you're doing, and take care of yourself, your family, your loved ones, and everyone there, and look forward to connecting again soon. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks, David. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. So just a quick heads up, we have announced our summit date this year. It's going to be maybe in person. It's going to be definitely online. Try and hold the date, 17th to the 19th of November. We'll probably do a New York in-person event. Might be a lot smaller than the past, but we're definitely going to do an online event, and most likely we'll do a hybrid event of both. That's really powerful. So just a heads up to hold that date. You'll see an announcement coming out soon with content and speakers and ideas and provocations. It's going to be a big one. And finally, just back to Gabe, just thanks everyone for being here. Some great insights. I really appreciate your time with us, and look forward to connecting with you over the next few weeks. We got some fantastic sessions actually coming up. Maybe Gabe, you want to let people know. Thanks everyone. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.